As I mentioned earlier, I'm joined by two legal minds, one in studio, one joining us virtually from Johannesburg, South Africa. I'll begin with you, Professor Migai Akech, inaugurated Professor of Law. And we also have joining us from South Africa, Thuku Mburu, who is a Program Officer, International Commission of Jurists, Kenya. And all right, we'll get into that. But first, Thuku, the International Commission of Jurists had raised the same concern. What is the scope of this operation? For how long and in what areas? What do you make of the recent development where the Defense CS says until normalcy is restored and covers the entirety of Kenya?
Thank you, Oliver, and thank you for having us speak on this session. And like Prof said, the orders were very clear, and the vagueness, the Gazette notice that was given by the Cabinet Secretary should be put into question and should be interrogated further by Kenyans. So you see, it was a wrong political decision that was being made by the executive. And you see that wrong political decision was seen on the 25th of June when he was trying to purport to order a state of emergency under Article 241B, that there's an emergency and there's a disaster. After they realized that mistake, they reassembled very fast in Parliament the next morning to get Parliament to approve that no, it's not a disaster, it's not an emergency, it's actually unrest and instability. And like you've also mentioned in your highlights, it's shrouded in secrecy. And we have it from members of Parliament from the opposition saying that this motion was debated for just 30 minutes. There was no media. Kenyans don't have access to the answers on the deliberations that were made. We don't know the modus operandi of the KDF deployment. And like Prof said, I don't think the situation in Kenya warrants to be interpreted as a state of emergency or as a conflict that warrants the deployment of the Kenyan Defense Forces among civilians.
Listening to Judge Lawrence Mugambi, and Thuku posed this question to you. He said, he pointed out that Parliament was essentially invaded. The Supreme Court was vandalized. We had fire set to the City Hall. Does that not qualify then as an emergency?
That doesn't qualify as an emergency. Let's just start from there. Because we know the peaceful protests that were being held across the country were infiltrated by sections of the citizenry that now started looting, destroying property, and in that process, some other people were also injured. But that is not enough to say that the country is now unstable, not operating. And this was, so the political elite felt threatened by this. And you see, protests are a language of people that are not being heard. It is a language of the unheard. And people in expressing that anger then were invaded Parliament. But I don't think invading Parliament buildings warrants the deployment of KDF amongst civilians. So I think the learned judge erred in that sense when, because as Prof now explains, there are grave violations that people will face. Freedom of expression, for instance, will be curtailed. Freedom of movement will be curtailed. Freedom of persons and their security. We saw people being now abducted in commando style, without any cause, arbitrarily, So these reasons are very strong reasons against why the deployment should not have happened. People have seen what militaries have done in other states, and they wouldn't want to see that happening in Kenya. So when a political regime, and the deputy president is on record saying this, that the justice system or the policing system in Kenya cannot be used to criminalize people, and when people are trying to hold them into account. So I don't think those reasons justify the deployment of KDF among civilians.
All right. Thuku, something that you raised, because the ICJ has written extensively on these protests since they began, and this will be your last comment on this issue, so you can tag on your final remarks. And this is what you wrote, that following the 25th June Gazette notice by defense, and by I mean the ICJ, following the 25th June Gazette notice by Defense Cabinet Secretary Aden Duale and the National Assembly's approval on 26th June, the Army was deployed to support the National Police Service. After the military's deployment on 27th June, human rights observers have documented the unlawful dispersal of peaceful gatherings, arbitrary arrest of protesters and their ill treatment, including stripping protesters semi-naked. And you go on to make the point that while those who may not protest peacefully forfeit the protection of peaceful protest under the Bill of Rights, they do maintain the other rights. And why did you find it necessary to make that point?
We found it necessary to make that point because we know and we understand the nature of protests, especially protests that are faceless, that don't have an apparent leader. So the nature of such protests are sometimes they are infiltrated with violence. We have citizens or people who we can call opportunists who take advantage of such protests and cause violence, breach peace, destroy property, and even cause harm to others. But even as they do that, they are properly laid out procedures on how such protesters can be handled, or such opportunists should be handled. And the proper law is that arrests should be conducted, and not in the commando style that we have seen. Arrests should be conducted procedurally. So police should arrest these people. And during such protests, police also have the duty to de-escalate situations, assess situations, and see the kind of force that they are supposed to use. But in our situation, we've seen police using disproportionate, excessive, and unnecessary force, leading to the deaths of protesters. So what we are saying is that even as protesters, even as we have opportunists infiltrating the protests, police should continue to do their work according to law. So, and maybe my final remark will be, one, the world is watching, and kudos to the young generation and Kenyans at large, because now Kenyans have shown that they are acutely aware of the outwards journey that has gotten us to the current state of governance that we are in. And any clawbacks to these democratic gains that we have had by any institution, that be it the executive, be it the courts, be it our legislative, if they are going to introduce any clawbacks, then Kenyans should frown upon such clawbacks. So Kenyans should remain steadfast and should remain vigilant against such clawbacks.
Also, want to thank you, Thuku Mburu, all the way from Johannesburg, South Africa, for giving us your input as well.